For Asia, NATO is linked to the history of European colonialism and imperialism that shaped modern Asia and Asian nationalisms. And there are many ways really for decolonization and demilitarization, but with the increasing presence of force and militarization from the US and NATO, and reliance on military force as opposed to negotiation, as opposed to coexistence, as opposed to common security, what NATO and the US is following is absolute security for one at the cost of lessened or no security for the others. NATO presence in the Indo-Pacific region exacerbates what are actually regional bilateral conflicts, which need to be resolved regionally or bilaterally, and if they want, they can ask for neutral mediation. But NATO should not superimpose itself on these conflicts and create proxies, and that is a method that they've been using in Europe and elsewhere, in West Asia for example. Actually, the US administration and now the Trump administration, like the administrations in the past, they are focusing greatly on the Indo-Pacific, which was called the Asia-Pacific earlier. And they see this as what they say is a priority theater for American security and Western hegemony and primacy. And so in this, for the US, NATO is a partner and an instrument. After 2011, China became quite an obsession. NATO, of course, has accepted the US administration's strategic position. And you can see that in the 2022 NATO's own strategic concept, it identifies as NATO's main threats, and in quotes, it says that the People's Republic of China's stated ambitions and coercive policies challenge our interests, security, and values. So this brings NATO almost parallel with the American strategic objectives in the Indo-Pacific. So similarly, the US and Europe have echoed US interests in West Asia and the Persian Gulf. If you see Germany in its policy guidelines of 2020, they seek to promote a European Indo-Pacific strategy and to make, and again I quote, they would make an active contribution to shape the international order in the Indo-Pacific. And UK and France have similar policies. So this is what brings NATO into the Indo-Pacific. So NATO really is the offset for burden sharing of the US's China problem and is complicit in US policies in West Asia to ensure primacy in the region. But by doing this, NATO is actually violating its own preamble of promoting stability and well-being of the North Atlantic and seeking to project its power towards these threats that it's constructing, like China, which is 12,500 miles away from Europe's eastern front. So I think people in the East would ask, why does NATO, which is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, want to do this entry into the Indo-Pacific? And how are they doing this? First is by direct and renewed bases in the region. And I want to give here one important case, and that is the activation of this little island called Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, which is a major base now for the refueling and base for B-52 bombers that have recently been attacking the Houthis in Yemen and are ready for any attack in Iran. Now, Diego Garcia was a UK-controlled island in the Chagos Archipelago, a group of islands in the Indian Ocean, and the original inhabitants were forcibly forced out in 1969-71, and then it served as a joint US-UK base. And in all the wars in this region, whether these were from US or US allies or NATO, whether it was the Iraq war, Afghanistan, the Yemen bombings, this base has been used by these B-52 bombers. Now in 2019, the International Court of Justice gave a ruling because Mauritius, to which these islands originally belonged, went to the International Court of Justice and they gave an advisory opinion that said that these islands need to go back to Mauritius. So just on April 1, 2025, the Trump administration renegotiated with the UK and Mauritius that Britain will transfer the rest of the islands to Mauritius, but they would retain Diego Garcia by leasing it for 99 years as a base for US and its allies. So that is why this base has been upgraded, and apparently now it has at least 5 B-52 bombers, and it's a place where no one else can enter. The second kind of method is that in this region there are several hotspots and potential theaters of conflict, and the US has entered into each of these contests, or at least tried to enter in a very systematic and a long-term way, in a way that they want to be the pivot in these conflicts. For example, one, in Taiwan, where US gave up their traditional policy of strategic ambiguity and now are encouraging the government. I'm not going into the details of who's right, who's wrong, but it's obviously irking China. Second, the Korean Peninsula, the North and South Korea, which never had a peace treaty ever since the war and then the Cold War which followed. Now the US sees this as its security strategy to keep an eye on Russia, China and North Korea. All three are their security factors. Third, the US and Philippines, they have agreements for 4 new military bases here to be used by the US, including in a province facing the flashpoint of the South China Sea, which Filipino academics like Walden Bello have said it recolonizes the Philippines, these base agreements. So this is in addition to 5 earlier bases, besides a huge number of military exercises. The Philippines chief has said just a few days ago that if there is any issue in Taiwan or an issue between the US and China, as members of the armed forces of Philippines, we are ready for war, and that we cannot be a neutral bystander. So the contested islands of the South China Sea are extremely dangerous, even though currently there are these fisher boats from the Philippines which clash, but the Chinese also from their part claim some of these reefs and islands. So this is militarizing the region. Japan has increased its defense spending to 2% of its GDP. The US-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty has been strengthened. And the 2 Koreas which were having regional talks, bilateral talks, those have got nullified because the 2023 military agreement to lower tensions between the 2 Koreas is nullified, and in response, Korea increased its missile launches by 40 times. It formalized the use of nuclear weapons, and it negotiated a defense agreement with Russia. So you can see there is this militarization, counter-militarization of the Indo-Pacific going on. The next method, the other method, is a plurilateralized and militarized platforms like the Quad 2007 for climate and health and maritime security. That was the intent, signed between the US, Australia, Japan and India, which China sees as a provocation and threat. It is meant to curtail Chinese influence, and the objective is a free and open Indo-Pacific to maintain maritime freedom under international law. But everyone knows Indo-Pacific is very wide, and one can have international law treaties under the law of the sea for this maritime protection, as opposed to these kind of groupings. The other is the AUKUS, that is Australia, UK and US, where the big 3 nations are part of a security pact since March 2023, where the US is now going to give Australia nuclear submarines. So for the first time, Australia will get nuclearized. Again, China sees this as a major threat. Then there are these little security pacts. So China signed a security pact with the Solomon Islands in 2023, and this led to US security and economic deals with 3 Pacific islands, Papua New Guinea, Palau and Micronesia. Then another method of military engagement in the Pacific are the bilateral memorandums on what is called the Enhanced Defense Cooperations and Logistics Agreements. These are first with the US and Philippines, their mutual defense treaty that can see the US intervening in any issue that the Philippines wants, and it's called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which enhances the military spending and the militarization of the Philippines. Now, there's also a counter-militarization. China, Russia and North Korea are doing what we call strategic mirroring. So if NATO does something, they also increase their defense expenditures, and they have bilateral cooperation agreements for their own security. And for example, China does these military drills around Taiwan. It is firm on saying Taiwan is of China, and they will not brook any independence, but they're willing to have a kind of a status quo, an ambiguous status quo, and incorporate them through trade and economic relations. But if there's any provocation, they also start with their own counter provocations. Similarly, China has been having a creeping occupation of some of the Philippine reef. First it was the Mischief Reef, when the US left, earlier the US left Philippines and now it's come back. This reef was an exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, but by 2009, China also submitted what is called the 9-dash line, which claims a large part of the South China Sea, including sections of the islands which is Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei and Philippines. Philippines took this case to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague that declared that Chinese claims were invalid, but of course China rejected them. So this threat of a conflict around these reefs and islands and little clashes between fisherfolk and Chinese boats remain. So there is a lot of tension around the South China Sea, in which the US and NATO are interested in being a balancing power and intervening. According to my reading of the Chinese press documents, what their leaders say, what Trump says, what NATO says, what the Indian leaders say, China is definitely not interested in a war. They're interested in trade and moving ahead economically and being a very big economic and technological power. Who in the global south has ever been a hegemon? Zero. Yes, they have been regional hegemons to some extent. They project their power regionally, but they've never really had any major hegemony. So they wouldn't like a war. Most of the Asian governments are quite aware that war will take them back, will disrupt their economic development, will break the global south. And this is exactly what civil society movements are saying. Of course, in all these countries, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Philippines, in Pakistan, the military has a great say. Now in India, with these terror attacks, again, there's a rise of tensions and we don't know which way it will go. But hopefully, I think there will be sense that war is not the right thing. And we've seen what happens in wars. There are so many wars going on. The world is at war, and our real threat are threats of climate, of poverty, of getting women into roles of participation. So Asian countries have a long way to go, and civil society voices are the ones which are talking about these human security and common security ideas, and they all hope that their governments will listen to them. All these Asian countries who are just about becoming from least developed, they've become medium, or they've got higher human development indexes. They're looking at human security. They were the Asian tigers. With that, they're buying more and more US and Western or any other arms. So with this, with the absence of rules of conflict, the only method is balance of power that keeps conflict from breaking out, but it's very unstable, and such regimes can break down, leading to very catastrophic wars. So there is need for bilateral talks and Asian level talks to reduce tensions, to work out outstanding territorial and maritime issues and have regional solutions. And NATO should stand and support these, as opposed to coming in with a culture of reconstructed kind of colonial imperialist violence, or a culture of militarism, which, and everything gets weaponized, trade gets weaponized, relations get weaponized, and this militarization diffuses into other social and economic structures, and popular ideas become ahistorical. Ordinary people are ignorant of these historical contexts, and all kinds of extractive and profit methods come in at the cost of the people and planet and the climate. NATO presence in the Indo-Pacific region exacerbates what are actually regional bilateral conflicts, which need to be resolved regionally or bilaterally. What NATO and the US is following is absolute security for one at the cost of lessened or no security for the others. And this is not acceptable by the others, no matter how small they are. So if the Houthis have no security, they'll fight on. So it's better to have some kind of security framework in which all others can also be satisfied and reassured. NATO's expenditure and CIPRI's expenditure has really gone out of control to some trillions. And of that, NATO spends 55%, with the US spending the large majority of it, more than 9 other countries which follow. China, of course, comes next with 12% and Russia with 5%. Asian countries have very clearly spoken of strategic autonomy and neutrality. In fact, as India and China have had a long standoff on their border, they share a long border. It's called the line of actual control. And from 2020 to about 2023, there were clashes, not war, but clashes. And in one of them, in Galwan, India lost 20 soldiers and they took it very badly. And there was a Cold War. But they kept some conversation and communication going between field commanders of the two sides. That's one thing. This has now come to a level where the Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Indian Prime Minister Mr. Modi met at the sidelines of the BRICS conference in Kazan last year, and they said that there should be disengagement and some kind of conflict management. And since then, the Indian Foreign Minister has said that a large number of friction points, maybe 75 to 80%, have been actually resolved, and there's de-escalation from that. The third thing is, during the Ukraine war, I think the Indian Prime Minister said several times, this is not a time for war. So I hope he takes that seriously on the India-Pakistan issue also, that this is not a time for war. India's sustained GDP will go down. The fourth thing is that during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, NATO members, European leaders, American Assistant Defense Secretaries, they all came to India one by one and said that India should be on the side of the US and NATO. And one of them also said, because if there's an India-China war, it's ultimately us who will be helping you, not Russia. But to which the Indian position was that we don't want any internationalization of our bilateral conflicts. And this has been a position for the last 30 years. So whatever the bilateral conflicts, they would resolve it themselves, which I think is a good thing, that you don't internationalize so you don't fall into some other group's national interest. You're not going to be echoing NATO's interest. So I think similarly with the ASEAN countries, they want to be neutral and practice strategic autonomy. They have been for the last 12 years been negotiating a code of conduct with China on maritime issues. Sadly, that's not been finalized, and it should be, but they have said clearly that they don't want to take any sides in case of any conflict. The US, China, India, all of them should work out these rules, get back to international law, the law of the seas, and for a more peaceful Indo-Pacific.